Greetings and hello to everyone. This is the Business of Betting podcast, and I'm your host, Jake Williams. Today is episode 35, and we have Scott Ferguson joining the show. Scott grew up in South Australia before heading up to Darwin to join corporate bookmaker Darwin All Sports. Since then, Scott has travelled around the world working in betting education, betting exchanges at the Horse Racing Bettors Forum and consulting. This podcast is proudly sponsored by Betfair. Betfair operates a betting exchange and is licensed in the Northern Territory of Australia. Residents of Australia can join Betfair by visiting betfair.com.au and support this podcast by using promo code BOBPOD. Please gamble responsibly. As always, you can find us at businessofbetting.com or at bettingpod on Twitter. Please fire in any questions or feedback and potential guests you would like to hear from. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy my chat with Scott Ferguson. Today I'm joined by Scott Ferguson. Scott, thank you very much for joining me.
It's a pleasure, Jack.
So Scott, where did you grow up?
Grew up in country South Australia, a place called Mount Gambier, which is halfway between Melbourne and Adelaide, and in racing circles, most famous for having a horse track with a dogleg in the straight, which is very rare in Australia.
And did you spent your childhood in Australia? I know you're not there now, but you call Australia home?
I still call Australia home. I've been in the UK for about 13 years now, but no, I still call Australia home. So
how did you get involved in betting and racing, I would imagine? Did it start younger, or did you sort of develop into it in your teenage years? Take us through your sort of evolution.
It started pretty young. My first memory is being taken to the doctor at Warnwood Racecourse for running around barefoot and getting a splinter in my foot when I must have been 3 or 4 or something like that. So it's in the family for a long way, but just actually my mum's side, my mother and my grandmother were just hobby punters, really, and sort of got me from there.
So were you primarily horse racing back in your Mount Gambier days?
Yeah, well, back in those days, sports betting didn't exist in Australia really until about 1990. So when I was 20, so it was very much sort of thoroughbreds and harness racing.
And how did you get started working in betting? I know a lot of people are involved sort of on weekends, or they have a casual bet here and there. What prompted you to get involved in the industry, and how did it all get started for you? Well,
I spent quite a few years at uni, sort of bumming around and not really knowing what I wanted to do, and then came to the end of a sports administration course. I was going to get into event management, and then I saw an ad on the back of the Sportsman for a job at Mark Reed's up in Darwin, International All Sports. Turns out that was basically the only way they could advertise at the time. If they advertised a job, they could advertise in national papers. But they said, come on up, we'll give you a 2-week trial, which I'm sure are probably against some sort of labour laws these days. But basically, you back yourself and go up, and within a week they'd sort of hired me, and thought away we went. So I was up there for a couple of years, and that started my career in the industry.
So most people would know IS and are probably aware of Mark Reed. Take us through what you did in your sort of starting out there after your 2 weeks. It sounds like your 2 weeks went well enough and you stuck around.
Yeah, so I walked in there. It was Australia Day '98. I remember watching. That was the William Reid. I think it might have been the first one or one of the very early ones at Moonee Valley under lights when I was there. And so sports and sort of racing, and they give you a grounding and everything. And basically this is what I know you've learnt plenty of stuff in the past. Well, we want you to do it this way. And you basically start on Western Australian racing, which was fantastic. It's a very small pool. You've got 2 tracks, well, basically dry tracks all season. Very few horses travel across, and if they do, it's usually one way. And a small pool of horses to work from. Easy to do the tapes, that sort of thing, and you just learned all the techniques they had of how to read a race, all the data they had in their database, which was pretty revolutionary at the time. This is going back 20 years. Now it's fairly sort of commonplace. And go from there. It was a fantastic sort of grounding, and from there you sort of saw. You also took bets as well, so you weren't just a a race reader. You'd also trade the markets and take calls on a Saturday when it was quite a small operation. Mm-hmm. And you'd soon learn what not to do from losing punters, and you'd get a fair idea about what the winning punters were doing as well. You'd basically track them, not so much to limit them, but just to learn what they were doing. So, right, this guy's got a very good strike rate connected to this stable, and he only backs favourites at certain times or things like that. And you focused on habits of winning and losing punters, and that sharpened your mind up very quickly.
So how did you do that back then? Was it just in your head and using sort of gut understanding of what was going on, or did you monitor, track, and profile even back then?
It was a little bit of profiling. It's nothing like what operators do these days and shut you out very quickly. But it was, in those days, it was very much we'll lay bets. Unless it's a huge amount, we'll take them on. And if it was a good client, you'd take the bet and you'd pass on the money on. There's huge amounts of betting back going those days around bookmakers, and it doesn't seem to be the done thing anymore. But you'd know that such and such was connected to a stable, or they, and if you did, it was. Nowadays, you're talking about Melbourne Sydney racing. They've got prices out on a Wednesday night or Thursday morning. These days, the only price you had back in 98, 99 were they were opening up Saturday morning. So you had them on a piece of paper. You might have just started trickling on the internet, and if you knew someone was connected to a stable, you might give them 5 to 1 instead of 9 to 2 or 4s, and just try and sort of throw them a bone and see if you could take a tip.
Okay. And what were some of those revolutionary techniques, just for sort of history's sake, that you were using way back then that are probably commonplace now?
Mark's big thing was just the database they'd come up with. It was just they put so much work into it, and back in the days where it was a big slog rather than the systems and coding with R and all things you can do now. But it was just being able to align form from different states and different levels of races. I remember one year we had the Darwin Cup up there, and for the Darwin Cup Carnival, you have horses coming from Perth, from Adelaide, from Melbourne, from Brisbane, and from every provincial and outback venue in between. So the form lines are just all over the place, and this system basically gave us markets that were just nothing like what the guys on the track in Darwin were doing, and it was rather profitable for the guys that were punting on them.
And what about back in those days? Were employees of race and sports books allowed to bet themselves? Was it something that was frowned upon, or was it something that was positive to be able to, get on the other side of the counter essentially and learn some things from the betting side? How was that back then? I know there was probably regulations or even laws about it, but what about the actual happenings back then?
This was Northern Territory. The laws, no, nothing back those days. Can't remember the exact quote, but it was something like, "We'll pay you this." Mm-hmm. No, it's not very much, but if you're not making at least that much on the side as punting, you shouldn't be working this job.
Okay, interesting. And what sort of people were they looking for? Did they just anyone who was happy to go up there for a couple of weeks, they were willing to give them a shot? Or was it, I know you mentioned university, did some of that background assist in getting involved in those days?
It was more, they like to have someone with a degree, but it was more the fact you'd be dedicated for that amount of time. Whether you did an arts degree and you were destined for McDonald's, or it was a high-tech sort of computer science degree or something like that, at the time it didn't really matter.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's much more sophisticated these days, and you're looking at people want economics degrees and things in data science and stuff like that. But back then it was they'd prefer you were fairly raw, so they could train you your own way. You didn't come with your own set ways and things that they didn't rate from other book might have learnt from the wrong people. So it was very much of show us you've done something in the past that you're willing to learn and you can be dedicated, and we'll give you a go.
Sounds like it might have been a pretty good time up there with a lot of young people heading up north to the warm weathers and learning from scratch.
Oh, the guys that I used to work with in those days are geniuses. There's guys working for Pinnacle. There's some of the senior traders at the Tab. There's guys basically all over the world that have been one's trading director at William Hill these days. One has been one of the top guys there and has moved on. Most of the big shops in the world have had someone from that group at International All Sports. It was a fantastic time, that 2 years. It was just when it was breaking open, and Mark was very keen to bring in guys from the UK. That came over with a little bit of experience, and cracked the Asian sort of market. So we're dealing with massive sort of money that's probably doesn't get handled by corporate bookmakers these days, but just some of the sharpest guys I've ever met, and some of those guys are in Hong Kong or working in the Asian markets these days as well. It was a brilliant time, and Mark was great to learn off, and so were some of these guys I was working with at the time.
So how long did you spend there? What did you do after that?
2 years. 2 years living in Darwin for me was enough. It's a funny place. It's the second time round for the what they call the build up before it gets into wet season. Does many people's head in, and I'd had enough. Went to Singapore for about a year and a half, working for basically a .com on the other side of basically recommending sports betting.
Yep.
So Singapore and Malaysia. Then the .com boom went bust. And came back to Australia. Worked briefly in Tasmania for the original Tatsbet, which was an interesting operation. It was heavily restricted by the old directors of Tattersalls, who basically said it's a deep end of a swimming pool. We're going to shackle you and handcuff you. I'm going to throw you in the deep end of a pool and try and swim. You couldn't. The only place in the world that Tattersalls brand was any good was Australia. We weren't allowed to take a bet from Australia due to some interstate license, some law from about 1860 that no one had ever bothered about. But they were so frightened of losing their lotteries and pokies licenses that was just that was never going to go anywhere, no matter how good we were as traders.
Yep.
Or what we did abroad. So then that was ended about a year later, and then travelled the world and ended up joining Betfair, which lasted me about 6 years.
That's lawyers for you. But
yeah.
What about sports betting? How was it back then? Even after your IS days, was it still a minnow and sort of seen as second fiddle to racing?
It was very much second fiddle, but it was also something that was coming along because, having worked and while I was at Reeds, I sort of mixed between the racing floor and the sports floor. It was very much seen as this will come on, because if you try to do racing racing just started going 7 days, I think, at that stage. And if you were the man looking after a particular state, well, you never had any rest. These days you probably have, if you were doing it properly, you probably have several people doing it because there's that many meetings going on. Whereas sport, you can pick and choose.
Yeah, that's specialisation.
You can choose. You can even have your season and stuff like that, and you don't have to worry about. If you're focusing on the NFL or you're focusing on the Premier League or the AFL, you don't have to worry about horses coming from interstate and having their preparations that aren't synchronised. Whereas if you worry about a team sport, or they're all trying to do the same thing at the same time.
Let's talk price. Unlike bookies and totes, the Betfair Exchange is a low-margin, buy-sell, fixed odds marketplace where the value stays with the punter, not the house. Ready for the game within the game? Join betfair.com.au. Gamble responsibly.
You moved over to the UK and started with Betfair. What was the, attitude back then to an exchange like Betfair? How early was it? What was some of the competition like with some of the other sort of established bookmakers?
Oh, it was very early days. I went travelling in Europe for a while, and I'd been chatting to them for probably about a year or so via email, and there'd been a moratorium on expanding into Australia, so they didn't want to do it for the moment. But they said, if you ever come to London, drop in. So I dropped in. It was a warm summer's day, which must have got to about 31 for London, and I remember walking into their small office pre the Hammersmith days. And the lawyer sort of sitting there in a short T-shirt and his feet up on the desk. And this is pretty crazy. And there was about 30 in the office at that stage. And they said, "Oh, you should meet the commercial director. He's carrying his honeymoon." So anyway, I travelled around, and a couple of months later, I came back into London and met up with him, and then basically said, "How soon can you start? We want to get someone that knows Australia and on board very soon." So let me see. You're going to pay me in pounds. You're going to sponsor me and fly me home for work. So it's, okay, how soon do you want me to start? So did that for a couple of years to and fro, UK to Australia, and then once Betfair got serious about bringing in Australia, they sent out basically the big guns, Ed Ray and Mark Davies, and to Australia to try and to go through the proper process of getting a licence. And at that stage, particularly New South Wales Department of Racing and Gaming, we were getting very tight on everything we possibly did in terms of marketing and promotion. So it's like, I can't do this, I can't do that, I can't do that. Find me something to do, or I'll take up an offer in the Caribbean. So I came to London in August, just before the Athens Olympics, August 2004. And those days were, it was fairly sort of cavalier. The bookies in the UK hated it, but they just wouldn't shut up. And the more bookies moaned about it, the more punters loved it. And in the early days, Betfair generally was the punter's friend. It's completely changed these days, but as basically they've publicly listed and the share market took over. But those days it was fantastic. Anytime you spoke to punters, they absolutely loved it. Bookies sort of hated it. Racing people weren't really sure. Some loved it. Some thought, it's been stopping horses and blah 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 and all that sort of rhetoric that could never have gone on in the past, despite it just being a little bit more complicated in the past or shady. It was fantastic. It was, and the reason I came to the UK was basically the market was much more open to it. The Australian market's been deregulated since, but back in those days it was the advertising and that sort of thing for a firm that basically didn't have the retail monopolies was very closed. So over here it's much more open, probably a little too open to be honest, but it's great. Unfortunately, that all changed a few years down the track when Betfair floated, became very penny conscious, brought in the premium charge and all the gaming activities, which the founder Bert Black said he never wanted involved in it, and the two founders aren't basically involved in the business anymore. And ultimately, I'm one of these people who works for a particular boss rather than a firm, and they're long gone, and so am I.
So back then, you were in the education department. Is that correct?
Yeah. So initially, it was trying to spread the word in Australia. I had some fun times travelling around Australia. I once got brought in front of the stewards at Northam Racecourse in WA, which was a highlight, because one of the old bookies thought I was ringing up and passing the markets over, which was and it just basically showed how completely clueless some of these people were about how the exchange sort of worked.
So was it part of advertising and marketing, or was it something separate altogether and it was a necessary component for an exchange that was probably relatively unique back then?
It was a bit of everything. It was a bit of an all-rounder sort of in skills. So it was getting out there and meeting punters. It was demonstrating it to finding sort of big punters or significant punters and teaching them how it all works and why it was a better deal for them. But it was getting a nice few words in with drinking with a few press guys and getting the odd subtle sort of word in here and there where we could get away with it. Couldn't legally advertise, but you sort of plug, throw a few caps around and basically whatever you can get away with and try and subtly expand the brand.
So why was teaching so important? Did people not understand, backing and laying and those type of things that are sort of more common now?
Not at all. Like if you walked on a racetrack and you spoke to people that had worked in the game and or held a bag at some stage, then backing and laying, fantastic, is great. But others have a real track or a real struggle. Well, that's the price in front of you. I have to take it. Well, no. Why do you have to take it? Or if you don't like this favourite, why should you have to choose which one of the other 9 in the race to back? So that's I developed that as you went along, and eventually had an education department with a handful of people behind me, underneath me, and had a great time running seminars up and down the country, and did a few in Australia. I even got to a few places in Europe as well, as other territories wanted it. Running seminars, train the trainer courses, stuff like that. But I even had the guy who was CTO at the time, a guy called David Yu, who ended up becoming the CEO for a while. He came to one of the staff nights one night and thought, some of his staff had gone along and reported back via his PA and said, "This is good. I want you to do this for all my tech staff," because techies are like techies will just do the code and they'll be great at it, but actually understanding what they were doing it for would have no idea. And then suddenly I became sort of the link between the punters and the techies and trained them what they were trying to do, and that sort of, for a while there, improved the user friendliness and understanding why punters do certain things with the habits and why they're trying to lay the field and why they like scripts to be able to do this in a split second and stuff like that. But yeah, the education part was, I like sharing knowledge. I coach junior sport. When I was travelling Europe, I taught English for a little while. I like sharing knowledge and the education part of the betting and actually teaching people to, no, you don't have to take that price from a bookie or the tote. You can do this differently. You can back and lay. You can trade in play. You can lock in a position. If it's going the wrong way, you can bail out, and these sort of things. And seeing that change certain punters, particularly ones that had loved the punt but just had no idea what they were doing, that gives you a sort of nice sort of feeling, and you actually get some results out of that.
So was that really the birth of being able to trade? I know obviously people had multiple bets and back and lay and all that sort of stuff in theory, but in reality was the start of Betfair and building that knowledge base. Obviously now need other users, and the network effect of having a lot of people betting into those markets. Was Betfair in those days the start of sort of real trading as we know it now? Yeah, for sure. They weren't the first. They're the first one to get it right. Remember there being a handful of them starting off 98, 99, and I looked at a couple and we couldn't understand how they'd work because the interfaces weren't right and the logic wasn't right. But then Betfair basically simplified the interface. They brought in things like an in-play delay, so it wasn't just whoever's got the fastest feed or the fastest broadband connection, particularly in those days when internet connections were fairly dodgy and highly variable. Once that came in, all people at least had the perception of being an even playing field. Now you're still going to have people that are on super fast connections versus slower, and the pitches. When you have 7 or 8 seconds on cable TV. Cable or satellite TV being behind, what people can see on the track, those sort of things. But at least if they've got if things are brought out in front of them, they can at least watch the market and see what's going on. But being able to back and lay sort of change the industry. And for me, it's almost spoiled it because it's now, well, I can't really bet with the bookmaker too often anymore, and even if I want to, it's a struggle to get on. Yeah, or you feel bad because you missed the price on Betfair compared to what the other bookies might have for you. Mm-hmm. So was it common for other bookmakers at all, and even now I don't see it a whole lot, of having teaching and education or other content that can help punters? I know they, in theory, don't want to necessarily help punters win over a long period of time, but was that an unusual thing, even though Betfair kind of had to do it to get those people involved? It was very unusual. Usually it's, we used to say, if a bookmaker's telling you to do something, suggesting this to you, think about why. Ultimately, their profit is in your loss. Well, Betfair, they basically wanted to make money out of your commission. So effectively, you're only paying commission if you're winning. They just wanted to bring the two parties together. So that was what it was about. Now these days, Pinnacle do a great job of their content. Most bookies put a lot of content up, not necessarily educational, but certainly information. Yeah. But I think Pinnacle stuff, and I know several of the guys who write for them, they do a pretty good job of that. But I think Betfair's more interested in squeezing as much as they can out of punters these days across all their different products.
Rethink the way you see sport. Every action or play can be represented by a series of numbers. When you analyse this data, patterns begin to emerge. If you follow these patterns and develop systems, you can play the game within the game. Betfair.com.au. Gamble responsibly.
So I want to talk about the Horse Racing Bettors Forum. Tell us what it is.
Okay, so what are we? About 2.5 years ago, the Horse Racing Bettors Forum was set up in the UK. Set up under Nick Rust, who's from the BHA, who's the chief executive, to be at arm's length. It wasn't actually under them. It was just they said, right, let's get this going, and basically they wanted to recognise punters. So that any decisions they were making. So what's the The problem there is it with integrity? Is it with information? Is it the accuracy of data? Is it for what isn't being provided? What's the relationship with bookmakers like? Those sort of things. And yeah, it's been received pretty well. I actually stood down in September last year. A few other things on, but it's still going. There's actually an article in The Guardian this afternoon came out, guardian.co.uk, talking about how this finally got representation with a parliamentary committee about minimum bet laws over here. When the horse race, the HBF did a survey of punters, that was just the biggest thing by so far.
Yeah.
By Frankel distance, basically.
Black caviar distance for those in Australia.
Yeah, well, I just remember seeing the one at Royal Ascot when she fell in.
Well, yeah, that's true.
So I lost that one. But yeah, that one by far and away, that was the main thing that the success of the HBF was going to be judged on, whether it was that. But along the way, being able to take some small wins, such as wind operations, now have to be declared as of last week. Accuracy of race distances. Some of the tracks would be out by, jumps courses would sometimes be out by a furlong.
Wow.
And think nothing of it. And it's like, what? This is just ridiculous. And some, even some flat tracks up by 50 metres, 100 metres, something like that. There was a brand new all-weather track put in a couple of years ago at Newcastle, and they had one of the distances out by a good 40 metres. I think over 1,400 metres, 7 furlongs. How do you get that wrong on your first day?
It's incredible.
Just poor planning and blatant disregard for punters, really.
Yep.
You got that. So yeah, there's small wins along the way. Getting there, just basically getting bookmakers to engage has been very hard. But hopefully that's coming along. It's not. There are realists in there. It's not going to be a Milton thing saying you must have the rules like in Australia. It's not going to happen because basically the industry here isn't basically wearing the trousers like in Australia. It doesn't have as much power over bookmakers. But hopefully something can come along, even if it's a minimum bet to lose £200 or something like that. Just something to it's a bit of a mockery at the moment. Basically, how much bookmakers can get away with. It's just gone a bit too far, and they're not going to do it on their own unless they're forced to. And bring it back to a decent balance. Respect the fact that bookmakers have to make a living out of it, but also stop worrying about the gaming machines and actually try and go back to bookmaking. You've got a license. You've been given a license to lay a book. So how about laying a book?
So what was is there an aim or a mission statement, or is it very, very broad and it's, just generally taking on punters' interest? Basically
taking on punters' interest. It's not taking up disputes. There are plenty of arbitration services to do that. It's to take on basically higher level topics. So basically whatever the punter wants to go for. So one that's come up has been the discrepancy between picture feeds and certain track has been rumoured to be delaying pitches, leaving the track in order to, in their mind, in order to discourage fast pitcher traders at the track. Whether that's the actual reason for it is questionable, but that sort of thing. There are people out there that make money off that. Who basically want to trade either from the track or from home, and the fact that broadcast pitches are being delayed is an issue. Basically, if there's any more than just technical reasons, if there's any choice going involved, I don't think that's particularly fair, particularly if it's kept hush hush. Things like we talked about data there before with wind operations being declared. With gelding operations, I don't think were declared a couple of years ago, or at least not in the form guide properly. Accuracy of distances, making bookmakers display terms or bet to terms, and on course there are bookmakers basically have a freedom to bet to whatever terms they like, or a little bit of freedom. It's been a bit tightened up in recent years, but when I first came to the track in the UK, it's like the guy's betting like a 7th for 4 placings or something like that in a 25 horse race. It's like, how can they honestly do that? Why aren't they have set terms. There's a bit of a sort of market freedom in this country, which needs to be tightened up a little bit, I think, because I think bookmakers in this country, both corporate and on track, have a bit of a bad name. It might be my Australian views coming into that, and a bit biased because I've come from another side where it's all a bit more rigid, almost nanny state from Australia. But I think they could do a bit more for their perception.
So I think, and maybe sadly, it seems like an uncommon concept to gather, I guess, punters and bettors' interest together. Was this based on another body around the world? Is there other bodies that are doing this? I know, for instance, you're talking about some of the additional information. I think Hong Kong Jockey Club have the weight of the horse, for example, which I don't know how valuable that is, but I believe they offer that to everyone. Is there something in Hong Kong that has something similar, or was this a first of its kind?
Not that I'm aware of. There's been... There was something, I think, about 15 years ago, probably 20 years ago, before the turn of the century. But it was pretty small, and I don't think it had the official recognition. But it didn't last very long and died out. This one's actually, Nick Russ sort of set it up and was very keen to sort of get it going. They'd step out, they'd get someone from the BHA pop in occasionally when they're requesting information and wanted to understand sort of program scheduling and stuff like that. But then they'd also have people from the Racecourse Association or someone from a bookmaker and those sort of things in too. So, please explain these sort of things. We have punters perceiving this is happening. Is this correct? What can we do about it? How can we make it clearer? That sort of thing. There are there's been talk about one happening in Australia, in various states in Australia. I'm not aware of one getting off the ground. I know Richard Irvine's doing a great job there with getting the bet laws in place, but in terms of actual committees or groups to represent punters' rights, I'm not aware of any at the moment. Just one point there, you said on horse weights, that was also something that came up. Mm-hmm. And there's a valid reason why it's great in Hong Kong and it's almost impossible anywhere else, because you need to do it at a certain time and consistency at a certain time before the run on each horse. I see.
They have those training facilities, right?
For training facilities, it's very easy. When you have trainers spread out all over the country, it's the information. If you're doing it at the racecourse on the day, it's not really that useful. Ideally, you're doing it. You want the information to go to punters, so they know. So ideally, you get it to if it's 24 hours beforehand or something like that. But they need to be at the same place. Then you need to have the scales all over the place. It's very difficult. And British racing doesn't have a huge amount of money to throw around. You look at the prize money compared to Australia or Hong Kong. So spending money there when it could be used elsewhere it's low on their priority list. So I think it's fantastic for Hong Kong and those sort of places, but anywhere else that has a more diverse range of training centres, that sort of thing, I think would be very hard to implement.
So is the idea that it's good for the punter is good for all, or the industry itself, an oversimplification? I know obviously what's good for Jelco might not be good for your Spring Carnival punter in Melbourne. So How do you balance all that from the forum's perspective, or how did you? It's quite difficult.
You speak to, if you went into a betting shop in the UK and spoke to punters there who probably represents a good third of the people who bet on horse racing in the UK, not one of them would be worrying about having their accounts closed, because they're not the people. These are the people that sitting there for hours a day, betting small amounts on anything that aren't that educated. But that's sort of the way they sort of spend their day, and they love it. But then you've got the higher end of the scale, your Zelcos or people who aspire to be, like to think they're smarter or aspire to be smarter, bring in all these other issues that want to be sophisticated, that want to bring in data sort of stuff. You look at the response from race trainers this week in the UK about wind operations. It's like they think all punters are idiots. They're saying, only 2 out of 10 of these wind operations actually have any benefit, blah, blah, blah. It's as if they think the people are just going to back them blindly.
Yeah.
It's like it's just another data point, and of a lot of them. And if you just bet on it blindly, you will lose.
Yeah.
Okay. No one bets on blinker changes blindly or gilding operations blindly. You link it in with certain things. If a certain trainer declares a wind operation on the horse has done this and then resumes 2 months later in this type of race, well, then that's the one you might back. Similarly, blinkers, you have them on certain breeds at certain times are quite useful. It's just another thing that goes in there. But transparency it's just so hard to get transparency out of old school horsemen, that sort of stuff. But in Australia, it's very much the industry sort of controlling, sort of wearing the trousers. It's very much this is what's good, and everyone does their media interviews, and they're all very promoting the industry, and they recognise that. Here it's much harder because you get a lot more private trainers and private and retained jockeys who just basically work for one trainer who they're not interested in outside rides or outside horses because they are paying basically on the salary of someone incredibly rich.
Yeah.
So therefore they feel they have their job is not to say anything, and I think it's a shame.
So has it been successful, or is it successful enough for other jurisdictions perhaps to get on board, have something similar? What's the progression looking like for the next couple of years, do you think? It's
getting there. A lot of these things take time. It won't sound great to the man in the street who's been whinging about minimum bet laws and that sort of stuff. These things take time. As a racing authority to get data changed and that sort of stuff, well, you need to get the likes of a wind operation into databases. They need to change things both on the data side, also change the mindset of the trainer. So that's something that was raised 18 months ago, 2 years ago. And similar. So minimum bet laws or anything involves government and stuff like that, the machinations for that take ages.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of things that take time. These things can't be judged over 6 months or 12 months. And the guys that are still there have done and the few of us who stepped down have done a great job. And I hope it continues that way because I think whether they achieve anything major or not, I think it's irrelevant. I think it's at the very least punters need to be represented, and when decisions are being made by the BHA and even bookmakers stuff like that, or needs some sort of representation to at least say, hey, just hang on a sec, just make sure you're thinking about us. Because there's IBAS there, which is the Independent Betting Arbitration Service, I think is what they stand for, and the Gambling Commission, they have their roles, and there's a gap basically in between. I think the HBF is doing a good job and needs to continue.
So I want to switch gears a little bit and ask about sort of tech and product. Is there anything you've seen that you're bullish on for racing that sort of can help combat the threat of sports betting? I know we've seen things like cash out or crazy bonus bets and silly markets that they're throwing out there, but anything sort of to help the longevity of racing that you've seen? What's sort of the feeling over there in the UK about the future of horse racing?
Well, the big one here for the UK is what's going to happen with the tote. So the tote was sold off about 5 years ago to Betfred, to Fred Dane, who basically the tote came with a lot of shops, real estate, and he basically saw it for the real estate rather than the actual tote product. His exclusivity over that product ends middle of this year, in July. So now the racing industry has basically stepped up to create their own tote in competition. And now there's going to be a turf war over who has the rights in the shops, who has the rights on the tracks and online and blah, blah, blah. And there's going to be competing totes. Totes are like exchanges. You need one. Any more than one is too many. It'll just basically cut each other's throats on liquidity, and it'll struggle. But it'll take a while to get to that state. What has happened with the racing back one is that virtually all the courses, bar about three or four, have gone with the racing one. So on course it'll go that way. What they've also done is teamed up with Colossus Bets. Now, Colossus Bets is the operation which is backed by Bernard Marantelli, an Aussie sort of very, very shrewd operator. Has made his money out of punting. And they basically have Colossus Bets, mostly bets at the moment, mostly does things on football and sport, where you can have syndicates and you're basically trying to pick a dozen sort of things, a dozen sort of results, and go for a 3 million or 5 million sort of pound jackpot. Okay. But you can always cash out So if you've got the first 2 legs in, and so you get a text message if you've switched your notifications on and said, right, your £20 ticket is now worth £75 for 100%. Would you like to cash some of it out? And you can take 5%, 10%, 50, 90, the whole lot.
Is it fair margins in that or not?
Well, you won't be doing it to give away, but I think there'll be decent sort of margins.
Okay.
And I think, my assumption is that the plan with that is, if you can allow cash outs on those huge jackpots, the only people who aren't going to take it if they get down to the very final leg are the ones that are already loaded.
Yeah.
So if you've got a punter who's a 50-pound punter or smaller, and he's suddenly got a chance to win a couple of million, and he's got one game left on the Monday night, so that £2 million jackpot's not going to go off.
Yeah.
Because he's got to have cashed a fair chunk of that out. And I think that's the business model. It makes perfect sense. I think cash outs in general, I think, is tightening up. Some of the margins that hit early were quite ridiculous. But I think as it becomes more competitive, as more operators sort of tweak their algorithms and try and be more competitive, I think they get tighter. But they've got a niche there which hopefully builds on racing. I think it's pretty exciting. Some of the people listening to this will know that when the Scoop 6 jackpot gets massive over here, I run a syndicate basically, and it gets into the millions. And I've had over 100 sort of people joining that for as little as £20, and some up to 1,000, sort of chipping into that. Never had the success of winning it, but a syndicate and great fun.
Yeah.
A lot of admin work though, which is really painful. But unfortunately, the tote has got to a state where I don't think I've had one of those for 18 months now, 12 or 18 months. It's just dropped down. It's really sad. The Scoop 6 is a great product, but unfortunately, just the way the tote's currently operated isn't working. But when Colossus comes in, and I think they're just running the tote pool here for the exotics, and I don't think they're doing the win and play stuff. But for the exotics, I think they'll spice it up. They'll have a budget. They'll have access to punters. I think they can do quite a bit with it. I think they're looking to get international commingling and that sort of thing in there. If they can get some serious money in there, especially on those big pots, it's like, okay, we've got an exciting product again.
Interesting. Do you have any advice for younger punters or bettors out there who want to get involved in racing or bookmaking or things like that? Obviously, you've had your path, and we went through a little bit earlier. Is it easier these days with so much more information? If you're smart and shrewd enough, you can put it all together yourself, or is it harder because there is so much more out there and potentially more competition?
Double-edged sword, that one. There's so much information out there, and there's so many things that you can basically pick on virtually anything and specialise in it. But for the main part, most of these sports are going to be, all the pricing and that is going to come from basically data modelling, because the information is out there. So it works both ways. The more obscure, the simpler and more obscure events you can find, the better it is to work on, because there's more of a chance of an edge. If you're betting on the Premier League, the NFL, the AFL, NRL, that sort of stuff, or Group 1 racing, it is extremely hard to find an edge. The information is all public. Yep. It's all been crunched in databases by numerous sources many, many times. If you're betting on obscure stuff, and I'll pull one out here. The Winter Olympics is coming up. Mm-hmm. There's some of these events no one ever prices up during the year, apart from every 4 years. And I'm talking about these new funky X game sports such as slope style and ski cross and snowboard and stuff like that, half pipe, etc. I don't have a clue. Some of the data's out there, but it's not something anyone ever bets on in between. You can bet on alpine stuff. You can bet on biathlon, which is a sport I love. It's great for in-play trading, by the way, and Nordic skiing. Yep. But in terms of these X game things, if you go out and do your homework, and you've got no idea how to pull a price together off data, you could possibly cash in here. Bear in mind, you're not going to make millions out of it because bookies aren't going to let you on for too much. But that sort of thing's a little fun because it's obscure, and you're not going to get beaten by a model because there is no model. Everything else is just crunched to the nth degree. It's extremely hard to get an earn out of sports these days.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I live in the US and I see the drafts, the NBA and NFL drafts, get covered to death. No one in the US is necessarily allowed to bet outside of Nevada. So when you have those offshores putting up prices again, no one's really necessarily spending time to go through it, and obviously you're not going to get too high stakes down or anything like that, but it's the same sort of thing. That specialization or niche areas can be lucrative.
Yeah, and at the same time, story from a few pros, some of the extremely big events, such as a Super Bowl or a World Cup final, they can actually go the other way because there's so much public money in there, they can actually skew the line.
Yep.
But that's at the very, very top of things. In between, it's quite hard. But there's data out there. Pick something small. I said when I started with Mark Reed, started on Western Australian Racing because it was a very small pool of horses, 2 meetings per week. They were worth worrying about, and you could go through the form. You had time to do it. Now there's so much going on that it is hard to do, or at least hard to do to find an edge. So pick a niche. If it's an Australian, I'd suggest doing something like Western Australian Racing, doing Tasmanian Racing or Tasmanian Harness or something like that. A small pool that you can work in and not be worried about sort of too many what they call shippers in US racing, travellers to muddy the waters, or a small league of football or basketball or something like that. But find the data, have a play with it, test some models, start small with your betting. And then go from there. But always remember, if something looks too good to be true, it probably is. You're probably missing something, and there'll be someone out there waiting to take advantage as soon as you open your purse strings.
So what about content in the betting world? What do you read or consume day to day or weekly, monthly, that type of thing? For those out there who want to get an insight into what you sort of tap into.
Oh, there's so much out there these days. It really depends what following at the time. These days, I'm sort of got so much stuff going on that my punting interests are almost sort of seasonal. I'll tap into sort of big events and not much else, and it's more for an interest. But I'll, when I have the time, I'll seriously set myself down and dig in deeply. But for the serious punt, but those opportunities aren't as common as they used to be. What do I read? Good question. I very much do my own thing. I like to read a bit sort of here and there, but I only use it to sort of supplement my own research.
Yep.
So for golf, for example, I might read sort of Ben Coley's stuff in the UK. Also helps the fact that I'm in a fantasy competition, a one and done golf competition with him. But so I'm there. For tennis stuff, I don't really read much at all anymore. Just have a sort of database that crunches numbers there. It's really sporadic, to be perfectly honest. There's that much out there, and I have probably far too many people I follow on Twitter. There's just feeds coming through, so I might occasionally sort of find something and read it. But in terms of regularly, it's not something I can swear by at the moment.
Okay, no, that's fine. No, I was just curious, because a lot of people say they've switched over and they just read, behavioral, cognitive books and things like that, or not specific betting content, and they're more into just other areas where they can add on to that.
No, in terms of books, yes. I was thinking more in terms of real-time content. In terms of books, very much doing plenty of sort of reading there. I have to pull my iPad out to go through some of these books I've read. So it's Trading Bases by Joe Peter. I think I really enjoyed. Yeah. Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, but that's been on the list for a while, which I haven't actually got to. I love Michael Lewis and Malcolm Gladwell stuff, more general sort of and behavioural economics and science, that sort of stuff. What I learned losing $1 million, Brendan Moynihan, more about share trading than anything, but about just losing your head and being in the wrong mindset. Also, that's also a good book about recognising when things change. One thing, speaking to pros, and you've had several on here in previous podcasts, you need to realise that what you were doing last year, 2 years ago, 10 years ago, will not make you money for much longer, if it still is. Things change. People catch up. If there's an edge in the market, someone else will find it and crush it to death. And markets change, particularly when you start getting into markets where people and exchanges and that, where people can actually start playing with the markets to trick it and move it around. Elihu Feustel, Conquering Risk, Nassim Taleb, Black Swan, some of those.
Yep.
Those sort of ones, fairly sort of general ones. I think probably the what I learned losing $1 million is probably one I haven't heard on many lists before.
Yeah, definitely. And those starting out as well who haven't sort of built up a bank of those type of books, it's a pretty good list, definitely. Before I let you go, Scott, and I really appreciate your time, Twitter address, do you mind if people reach out? Questions? I'm sure the betting forum stuff might be interesting for those around the world.
Absolutely. At Boris Ranting, which comes from, I used to play a lot of tennis, and I did once have hair. It was red. So that's where Boris comes from, and rant a lot. So Boris Ranting on Twitter.
Beautiful. Scott, I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much, and all the best for 2018.
Thanks very much, Jake. It's been a pleasure.
Residents of Australia can join Betfair by visiting betfair.com.au, and please support this podcast by using promo code BOBPOD. Gamble responsibly.